On the morning of December 13th, 1887, a housekeeper named Margaret Sullivan unlocked the front door of the grandest mansion in Pittsburgh and walked straight into the most disturbing mystery of the Gilded Age. The door had been bolted from the inside. Every window on the ground floor was latched shut, locks untouched. 2 feet of fresh snow blanketed the estate's 4 acres, and in that snow not a single footprint, not one. But in the center of the marble foyer, laid out with the careful precision of a funeral display, was a gown, emerald silk, beaded, still warm to the touch, still carrying the faint scent of lavender perfume, as if the woman wearing it had simply ceased to exist. Evangelene Vandermark, wife of Pittsburgh's most powerful steel baron, had vanished from a sealed room. No broken glass, no forced locks, no witnesses, no body. The police closed the case in 6 days. Her husband performed grief publicly for the rest of his life, and for 34 years the city forgot her name. But Evangelene had not forgotten them. Because before she disappeared, she had built a bomb not out of dynamite, but out of truth, and she had hidden it inside the very walls of the house where she was murdered. This is her story, and it is far darker than you are ready for. To understand what happened to Evangelene Vandermark, you first need to understand Pittsburgh in 1887. This was not a city, it was a furnace. Steel mills lined the rivers for miles, their smokestacks painting the sky in a permanent shade of charcoal gray that residents simply accepted as the color of prosperity. The air tasted of sulfur and coal. Children grew up breathing it. Workers spent 12-hour shifts in temperatures that exceeded 150 degrees Fahrenheit, feeding molten steel into molds with bare hands wrapped in leather so thin it offered almost no protection. And yet people came from everywhere, from Ireland, from Poland, from Germany and Russia and the crumbling empires of Eastern Europe. Tens of thousands of immigrants arrived in Pittsburgh every decade, drawn by the same impossible promise that if you were willing to sacrifice your body, this city would give you a life. What they found instead was a different kind of sacrifice. Industrial accidents in Pittsburgh during the 1880s were so frequent they had stopped making the newspapers. A boiler explosion that killed 3 men on a Tuesday might earn 4 lines on page 7. A cave-in that buried a maintenance worker alive would be noted, investigated for 48 hours, and then quietly filed under the category of occupational hazard. Because in Gilded Age America, the death of a poor man was not a crime, it was overhead. The men who owned these mills understood this completely. They had built legal and political systems specifically designed to ensure that no accident, no matter how suspicious, could ever trace back to them. They owned the newspapers that reported the accidents. They funded the campaigns of the judges who presided over any resulting inquiries. They employed the politicians who wrote the laws that defined what counted as negligence. It was a closed circuit of power, and it operated with terrifying efficiency. At the very top of this system stood Cornelius Vandermark. At 52 years old, Cornelius was what Pittsburgh mythologized, the self-made man. He had started as a common furnace laborer at the age of 19, sleeping 6 men to a room in a boarding house on the south side. But unlike most men in his position, Cornelius possessed a ferocious engineering intelligence. He had taught himself metallurgy from borrowed books. He had developed a proprietary method for refining steel that reduced production costs by nearly 1/3, and he had patented it at 26 years old, before any of his supervisors realized what he was doing. Within a decade, he was no longer an employee, he was an owner. Within 2 decades, he was an empire. He was a tall man, steel-gray-haired, with hands that still bore the burn scars from his years at the furnace. Though they were soft now, the calluses long gone, replaced by the smooth skin of a man who had not done physical labor in 20 years. Those who worked with him in his early days described a complicated transformation. The young Cornelius had genuinely believed his innovations could make the mills safer, could improve conditions for workers. He had spoken about it passionately, almost evangelically. But somewhere along the way, the idealist had been replaced by something colder, something that viewed human life not as a moral responsibility, but as a line item. His rise had not been achieved through innovation alone. In the cutthroat world of 1880s industrial America, Cornelius had learned that the most efficient way to eliminate competition was not to outproduce a rival, it was to destroy him. A strategic fire at a competitor's warehouse, a boiler malfunction at a rival mill timed to occur during maximum production, the mysterious disappearance of a competitor's chief engineer 2 weeks before a critical contract deadline. These were not random misfortunes, they were operations, planned, funded, and executed by a shadow organization that Cornelius had helped found, a consortium of Pittsburgh's most powerful industrialists who had decided, collectively, that the free market was an inconvenience they could simply eliminate. They called themselves nothing publicly, but in private correspondence they referred to their arrangement as the Circle. And by 1887, the Circle had been operating for 15 years. In 1882, Cornelius Vandermark married Evangelene Hartwell of Boston. The social press described it as the union of two American dynasties, new industrial money meeting old New England aristocracy. The wedding was held at Trinity Church in Boston, attended by 400 guests, covered in 3 newspapers, and celebrated with a reception dinner that reportedly cost more than most Pittsburgh steel workers earned in 3 years. What the social press did not report, because they did not know, was that the Hartwell family had been carefully and methodically destroyed in the 18 months before the wedding. Evangeline's father, Harrison Hartwell, had run one of Boston's most respected private banking houses for 30 years. He was not fabulously wealthy, but he was scrupulously honest, deeply connected to New England's financial community, and critically, he had begun noticing patterns in steel industry investment documents that made him deeply uneasy. Specifically, he had noticed that certain Pittsburgh steel companies were suffering catastrophic losses just before being acquired by their competitors at a fraction of their market value. The timing of these losses, always following some form of industrial accident, fire, or labor dispute, was too consistent to be coincidental. Harrison Hartwell had been quietly building a dossier. He never got to use it. Within 18 months of beginning his investigation, the Hartwell banking house had been systematically destroyed through a series of coordinated financial attacks, fraudulent loan instruments, manipulated investment vehicles, coordinated withdrawals by clients who had been pressured behind the scenes. The family went from comfortable prosperity to near ruin in less than 2 years. And then Cornelius Vandermark appeared in Boston society, charming and generous, expressing admiration for the Hartwell family's heritage, offering connections that might help Harrison rebuild. He was not there to help, he was there to acquire. His courtship of Evangeline served 2 purposes simultaneously. It gave his industrial empire the social legitimacy of a Boston banking alliance, and it neutralized Harrison Hartwell, because a man whose daughter had married the most powerful steel baron in Pittsburgh was unlikely to continue publicly investigating that steel baron's business practices. Evangeline had no idea. At 25, she was everything her social class had trained her to be: educated, elegant, multilingual, accomplished at piano, fluent in the subtle political language of upper-class New England society. She had attended Miss Porter's school in Connecticut, read voraciously in English, French, and German, and possessed an intelligence that was considered, by the standards of 1882, frankly inconvenient for a woman of her station. She believed she was marrying a man whose industrial innovations could genuinely improve the lives of American workers. She believed she was entering a partnership. She was entering a cage. The first years of the marriage were not obviously terrible. Cornelius was attentive, generous, publicly devoted. The Vandermark mansion on Fifth Avenue was a monument to excess, 4 stories of Gothic Revival architecture with carved stone gargoyles imported from French quarries, stained glass windows depicting industrial scenes, a grand ballroom for 300 guests, and an estate library containing over 3,000 volumes that became Evangeline's primary refuge. But marriages have their own kind of archaeology. You dig down through layers over time, and what you find beneath the surface tells you what you are actually standing on. Evangeline began digging in 1885. It started with small things, a conversation overheard between Cornelius and a business associate that stopped abruptly when she entered the room, a visit from a man whose name she did not recognize but whose manner suggested familiarity with violence, a reference in a letter she glimpsed briefly to something described only as the Rutherford arrangement, Rutherford being the name of one of her husband's most prominent competitors. 4 months later, the Rutherford mill suffered a catastrophic boiler explosion. 11 workers died. Cornelius acquired the facility at a liquidation sale 6 weeks later for 17 cents on the dollar. Evangeline noticed. She began spending long hours in the library not reading but researching. She began taking walks through Pittsburgh's working-class neighborhoods, speaking with mill workers' wives, listening to their accounts of accidents, of men who had raised safety concerns and then suffered suspicious injuries, of foremen who warned workers to stay silent on pain of being blacklisted from every mill in the city. She began to understand that her husband's empire had not been built on innovation. It had been built on graft. By the winter of 1886, Evangeline Vandermark had been conducting a covert investigation into her husband's criminal organization for over a year. She was meticulous, she had to be. One wrong step, one document found out of place, one servant who talked too freely, one meeting that Cornelius happened to walk past, and it was over. She used the freedom that came with her position. As the wife of Pittsburgh's most powerful industrialist, Evangeline attended dozens of business dinners, social gatherings, and formal events every month. She was present in rooms where the city's most powerful men spoke freely, assuming that the elegantly dressed woman with the glass of champagne was simply decorating the scene. They could not have been more wrong. She had concealed a small camera, one of the new portable photographic devices that were becoming available to wealthy consumers, in a decorative brooch. She had taught herself to operate it through careful practice in her private study. Over the course of 18 months, she photographed 9 circle meetings without detection. She copied correspondence from Cornelius's study during his overnight business trips. She traced financial instruments through contacts she cultivated carefully and quietly in Pittsburgh's banking community, men who suspected something was wrong with the city's industrial economy, but lacked both the evidence and the courage to act on their suspicions. And she kept a journal. The leather-bound journal was her primary archive, hundreds of pages of meticulous documentation covering the Circle's operations, its membership, its methods, its victims, and its finances. The journal was kept locked in her writing desk with a small brass key that she wore on a chain around her neck, never removing it even while sleeping. The household staff noticed the changes in her. Margaret Sullivan, the head housekeeper, a woman of fierce Irish intelligence who had managed the Vandermark estate for nearly a decade, later testified that Evangeline had grown increasingly withdrawn throughout 1886 and into 1887. Not sad, exactly, haunted, like a woman carrying knowledge too heavy for any single person to bear alone. Cornelius noticed too, though he drew the wrong conclusions. He interpreted her distraction as evidence of the social anxiety that wealthy women were presumed to suffer from. He arranged for Dr. Franklin Westbrook, the family physician, to examine her regularly. Westbrook prescribed rest and fresh air. He noted privately in his medical records that his patient appeared to be suffering severe emotional distress connected to marital difficulties. Language deliberately chosen to obscure what he was beginning to suspect was something far more serious. But Evangeline was not alone. Her younger brother, Edmund, had been pursuing his own parallel investigation from the outside. Edmund Hartwell had been a promising young attorney, Harvard Law School, brilliant legal mind, his father's closest confidant. When Harrison Hartwell's banking house collapsed, he had been working with Harrison on the investigation into steel industry irregularities when their father died. The official ruling was suicide. Harrison Hartwell found hanging in his banking office on a February morning in 1886. No note, no apparent motive, police case closed in 48 hours. Edmund had been devastated, then suspicious, then terrified because as he began investigating his father's death he started receiving warnings, first oblique, then direct: leave it alone, stop asking questions, go to California, start a new life, forget. Edmund did leave Boston, but he did not go to California. Instead, he went underground. He assumed a series of false identities, moving between Chicago, St. Louis, and smaller Midwestern cities, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks. He used borrowed names to access legal records, financial documents, and court archives that painted an increasingly horrifying picture of the organization his father had stumbled across. He maintained contact with Evangeline through a system of coded correspondence that she received through a trusted intermediary, a laundress who delivered to the mansion's service entrance twice weekly and who knew nothing of what she was carrying beyond the fact that she was well paid for her discretion. Their letters, later recovered from a hidden cache in a farmhouse in Westmoreland County, revealed the extraordinary courage and cold-eyed clarity of both siblings. They were under no illusions about the danger they faced. Edmund's letters frequently referenced their father's fate as both motivation and warning. Evangeline's responses were careful, systematic, focused. The the letters of someone who had decided that fear was a luxury she could not afford. They had developed a plan. The plan was ambitious to the point of recklessness. They intended to simultaneously release Evangelene's evidence to law enforcement agencies, investigative journalists, and political leaders in multiple cities, making it impossible for the Circle to suppress or destroy the revelations through their usual methods. They had identified an honest federal law enforcement contact in Chicago. They had cultivated relationships with 2 investigative journalists, including Michael Flanagan of the Chicago Tribune, who were independently investigating patterns of industrial corruption that intersected with their own findings. They were 3 months away from implementation when everything collapsed. On the evening of December 12, 1887, the Vandermark household followed its usual routine with almost theatrical normalcy. Dinner was served at 7 o'clock sharp in the formal dining room: roasted pheasant, greenhouse vegetables, a bottle of 1878 Chateau Margaux from Cornelius's private cellar. Margaret Sullivan, serving as she always did, noticed that Evangeline barely touched her food. Her attention kept drifting toward the frost-covered windows, toward the darkness outside, as if she were watching for someone or dreading their arrival. Cornelius, by contrast, was in unusually high spirits. He spoke animatedly about a new railroad contract, about expansion plans into Ohio and West Virginia. But Charles Henley, the butler, serving with his characteristic silent efficiency, noticed something that he later found impossible to explain away. Throughout the meal, Cornelius kept checking his pocket watch. Not glancing, checking. Deliberate, regular, like a man counting down to a predetermined event. After dinner, Margaret helped Evangeline dress for the evening. This itself was unusual. Evangeline typically wore simpler clothes when retiring without guests. But that night she dressed in her most magnificent gown, the emerald silk beaded, imported from Paris at a cost that would have fed a mill worker's family for 2 years. When Margaret complimented the gown, Evangeline smiled, the first genuine, unguarded expression of happiness the housekeeper had seen from her mistress in months. Then she embraced Margaret, held her for several long seconds, whispered that she had been like a mother to her, that her kindness had meant everything. Margaret was touched. Looking back, she understood it as what it was: a goodbye. There was one other detail Margaret noticed that she could not explain at the time. Around Evangeline's neck, alongside her usual jewelry, was a locket she had never seen before, small, silver, etched with Celtic knotwork. When Margaret asked about it, Evangeline said only that it contained something precious that must be preserved. She did not open it. At 11 o'clock, Thomas Brennan, the estate's Scottish groundskeeper, made his final patrol of the perimeter. Through a frost-covered window on the second floor, he could see Evangeline's silhouette at her writing desk, her pen moving rapidly across paper in what he later described as urgent, almost frantic strokes. It was the last confirmed sighting of Evangeline Vandermark alive. What was she writing? Her final journal entry, recovered 34 years later, tells us. She knew they were coming. She had intercepted a fragment of correspondence between Cornelius and another Circle member 3 days earlier that made clear her investigation had been discovered. She did not know exactly when they would move against her, but she knew it would be soon. She had spent those 3 days in a controlled fury of activity, completing her documentation, sealing her primary archive in the hidden chamber she had discovered months earlier behind the library's oak paneling, and dispatching a final coded telegram to Edmund warning him that their plan had been compromised and instructing him to implement their emergency procedures. She had prepared for this contingency. The hidden chamber, built into the mansion's walls with a ventilation system sophisticated enough to preserve documents indefinitely, was both her archive and her intended refuge. The plan was to disappear into the mansion's hidden passages, servant corridors built during original construction to allow staff to move invisibly through the building, emerge in the carriage house, and vanish into the Pittsburgh night. The emerald gown, left in the foyer with theatrical precision, was misdirection. Let them search for supernatural explanations. Let them waste time investigating locked doors and undisturbed snow. She would be long gone. It was a brilliant plan. It had one fatal flaw. The hidden passages had been built under Cornelius's direct supervision. He knew every entrance, every exit, every concealed panel and maintenance tunnel in the building. At 11:47 p.m., he walked into her study without knocking. He was not alone. Behind him stood 2 men she recognized from social gatherings, fellow Circle members. their faces carrying the cold, evaluative expression that she had learned to identify as men who had committed violence before and found it unremarkable. Cornelius held in his hands copies of her photographs, her documents, her correspondence with Edmund. "Did you really think," he said, in the quiet voice that was always more frightening than shouting, "that I wouldn't discover your little investigation?" He told her she had served her purpose, that their marriage had been a business arrangement from the beginning, a way to neutralize her father's investigation while acquiring access to Boston's financial networks, that she had now become a liability that could no longer be tolerated. He offered her a choice that was no choice: disappear permanently under a new identity, renouncing all claims to her evidence, her family's story, and any hope of justice, or face the same fate as the dozens of others who had threatened the Circle. Evangeline made her own choice instead. She ran for the hidden passage. He was already waiting at the other end. The morning of December 13th began with Margaret Sullivan's discovery of the gown, warm, perfectly arranged, lavender-scented, abandoned, and the 4 words written on a torn journal page beside it. "The truth must survive." The Pittsburgh Police Department assigned Detective Samuel Crawford to the case. Crawford was, by all accounts, the wrong man for the Circle to have drawn. In a department thoroughly compromised by political corruption, he was stubbornly, almost pathologically honest. 20 years on the force, a clear-eyed determination that his colleagues found professionally inconvenient, and an investigative instinct that bordered on the intuitive. He had solved cases that had baffled every other detective in the department by simply refusing to accept convenient explanations that didn't fit the physical evidence. He started with the servants. Their accounts, taken privately and under conditions that Crawford carefully constructed to insulate them from pressure, revealed immediate inconsistencies with the official narrative. Margaret told him about the nocturnal visitors, well-dressed men, arriving after dark through the service entrance, always meeting in Evangeline's study, always leaving before dawn. She told him about the locket, about the goodbye that hadn't been called a goodbye. Thomas Brennan told him about the ice house. The old stone structure built into the hillside behind the mansion had not been used for ice storage since 1885, when the Vandermarks installed electric refrigeration. But throughout November and December, Thomas had noticed fresh footprints in the snow leading to it, always small, always matching the boots found in Evangeline's closet, always at night. On several occasions, a faint light had been visible from within. And on at least 3 occasions, there had been a second set of footprints approaching from the direction of the public road, much larger, heavy work boots, appearing on the same nights as Evangeline's visits. The ice house, Crawford quickly concluded, had been her meeting point, her dead drop, her operational base outside the mansion's walls. He attempted to search it. Cornelius Vandermark blocked him with a legal team that materialized with suspicious speed, citing structural safety concerns and demanding a specific warrant articulating probable cause. Crawford obtained the warrant. He returned 3 days later. The ice house had been sealed with fresh mortar. The speed of that sealing, requiring skilled masons, substantial materials, and round-the-clock work, told Crawford everything he needed to know. Nobody seals a building that fast unless they are destroying evidence. The investigation was terminated on the 6th day. Cornelius's political connections had reached the police commissioner. The case was officially ruled inconclusive. Crawford was reassigned. He continued investigating on his own time. What he found, working in secret through early 1888, was staggering. He traced the systematic financial destruction of the Hartwell family, discovering that the instruments used to destroy Harrison's banking house bore the unmistakable fingerprints of coordinated institutional pressure. He found the suspicious thinness of the Boston Police Department's file on Harrison Hartwell's suicide, the furniture overturned, the scattered papers, the witness report of 3 well-dressed men leaving the building near the time of death that had never made it into the official record. He traced Edmund Hartwell's movements, the train ticket to Chicago, the series of hotel registrations under variations of false names, the pattern of a man in permanent, frightened flight. He found the farmhouse, the property in Westmoreland County, 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, purchased through a shell company traceable to Vandermark's business interests. Crawford visited it in late April 1888, and found what he would later describe in his private notes as the most comprehensive evidence of organized criminal conspiracy he had ever encountered. The walls of the farmhouse study were covered with maps, industrial accident locations marked in red, newspaper clippings, family trees connecting Pittsburgh's industrial elite, a large chart, a spider of corruption, Crawford called it, showing how Vandermark's empire had grown through the systematic destruction of competitors, financial records demonstrating coordinated stock manipulation, copies of correspondence between Circle members discussing specific eliminations, covertly taken photographs of Circle meetings showing Cornelius Vandermark and other prominent industrialists planning acts of industrial terrorism, and hidden behind a false wall in the cellar, a sealed chamber with dozens of additional documents extending the conspiracy into political assassination, judicial corruption, and the elimination of journalists and labor leaders. Among these documents, a photograph of the Consolidated Steelworks boiler room, marked in red ink with specific structural points, with notes in Evangelene's handwriting describing optimal placement for maximum impact, dated November 15, 1887, nearly 4 months before an explosion at that facility killed 17 workers. Crawford initially recoiled from the implication, but further documents clarified the terrible truth. Evangelene had not been a willing participant in the Circle's terrorism. She had been coerced. The Circle had been using Edmund's life as leverage, cooperate, provide intelligence on competitor facilities, or your brother dies. She had been feeding them information while secretly documenting everything they made her do, building a case that would ultimately condemn not just Cornelius, but the entire organization. She had been playing both sides simultaneously, at enormous personal risk, for over a year. Crawford was preparing to act on his findings when he noticed the surveillance, strange men outside his boarding house, mail opened and resealed, witnesses who had previously spoken openly now claiming they had nothing to say. On a rainy April morning in 1888, Detective Samuel Crawford was found dead in an alley behind Pittsburgh Central Police Station. Heart attack, said the official report. Excessive drinking, said the explanation. His wife later testified that he had rarely touched alcohol and had been in excellent health. All of his case files disappeared from the station on the same night he died. After Crawford's murder, Pittsburgh fell silent on the subject of Evangelene Vandermark. Cornelius continued his ascent. He joined the boards of major banks and railroad companies throughout the Northeast. He funded hospitals and libraries. He endowed professorial chairs at universities. He gave interviews about the importance of hard work and honest dealing, his voice carrying the practiced gravity of a man who has convinced himself that his public persona is his true self. He never remarried. He told anyone who asked that the loss of his beloved Evangelene had broken his heart. He lived for 16 more years, dying in 1903 of natural causes. He died wealthy, respected, and, as far as the world knew, innocent. The mansion was sold following his death, serving various purposes over the following decades, including, with horrifying irony, as a private club for Pittsburgh steel executives. Then, in 1921, renovation workers discovered inconsistencies in the library's dimensions. The external measurements didn't match the internal space. They broke through the oak paneling. Behind it was an 8 by 12-foot room, climate-controlled by a concealed ventilation system sophisticated enough that the air inside was still breathable, the documents still legible after 34 years of abandonment, shelves on every wall, a small writing desk, over 200 documents, photographs, and pieces of correspondence. And in the far corner, beneath collapsed wooden shelving and moth-eaten curtains, the skeletal remains of a woman in fragments of an emerald silk gown. Around her neck, a silver locket with Celtic knotwork. Inside the locket, a photograph of Harrison Hartwell and an inscription, "To my beloved daughter Evangelene, may you always fight for justice no matter the cost. Father, 1882. The medical examiner's report was careful and limited by the condition of the remains, but it noted two things clearly: evidence of a blow to the head consistent with murder, and perhaps more disturbing than anything else, scratch marks on the walls, fragments of broken pottery near the sealed entrance. She had been walled in alive. She had been alive when they sealed the entrance. She had clawed at the walls in the darkness. She had tried to dig through brick and mortar with her bare hands and pieces of her own jewelry. And scratched into the wooden floor, in letters still legible after 3 decades, a final message. Edmund, the circle continues. Stop them, justice for father, Ev 1887. Balance Part 7, The Reckoning 1, 2000-13000. The discovery triggered an investigation that the Pittsburgh Police Department, still partially compromised even in 1921, could not have conducted alone. Federal agents under the direction of Attorney General Harry Doheny took over, recognizing almost immediately that the scope of what Evangeline had documented required federal authority. Edmund Hartwell, now living in Los Angeles under the name Edward Harrison, 60 years old and carrying 34 years of exile and grief, was contacted by investigators and confirmed everything. He had spent 3 decades in shadow, changing identities, building a quiet life while waiting for the moment he had promised his sister would eventually come. He had never stopped believing that her evidence would be found. He had made sure, through whatever means available to him, that the farmhouse remained accessible and the documents it contained remained intact. When investigators came to him with photographs of what they had found in the hidden chamber, Edmund Hartwell, who had maintained remarkable composure through hours of questioning, was asked if he recognized the items. He looked at the photograph of the locket. He could not speak for a long time. She knew she was walking into a trap, he finally told them, but she believed her evidence would eventually be found. She was willing to sacrifice herself to ensure that the truth would survive. She believed that our father's death would not be in vain. She was right. The federal investigation that followed was, at the time, the largest corruption inquiry in American history. The Circle had been responsible for the deaths of at least 93 people over 30 years. Businessmen, labor organizers, investigative journalists, honest politicians, law enforcement officials, family members who knew too much. The methods ranged from staged industrial accidents and building fires to poisonings that mimicked natural causes. Crawford had been poisoned with a compound that produced symptoms indistinguishable from cardiac arrest, a technique the Circle's operatives had apparently used on multiple occasions. The conspiracy's reach extended far beyond Pennsylvania. Similar organizations in Cleveland, Detroit, and Chicago bore unmistakable structural similarities to the Pittsburgh Circle, suggesting coordination through channels that investigators were only beginning to understand. Members of Congress, federal judges, cabinet officials. The conspiracy had threaded itself through the architecture of American government like rot through old wood. Several prominent families whose names were still attached to charitable foundations, university buildings, and public institutions in 1921 were quietly implicated. The resulting scandal led to dozens of resignations and removals from public office. The Vandermark mansion was demolished in 1923. The site was eventually converted into a small park with a memorial to victims of industrial violence in Pittsburgh's early industrial period. The memorial made no mention of Evangeline's name. The families whose ancestors she had exposed still wielded enough influence to ensure that. But the reforms that followed her exposure were real. Federal safety regulations for industrial facilities, legal protections for labor unions that had been denied for decades, new oversight mechanisms for industrial corporations, changes to law enforcement procedures that made it harder to suppress evidence or contain investigations within corrupted local jurisdictions. None of it would have happened without the evidence Evangeline preserved. None of it would have happened without the 34 years Edmund spent waiting, and the faith both siblings had maintained across all those dark years that the truth they had risked everything to document would eventually find the light. There is something almost unbearable about Evangeline Vandermark's story, and I want to name it precisely before we close. She knew that she was walking into a trap on the night of December 12, 1887. Her final letter to Edmund makes this explicit. She had received the warning. She knew the plan had been compromised. She knew what was likely to happen to her. She went anyway. Not because she was reckless, not because she was naive, but because she had built something in that hidden room behind the library, 200 documents, dozens of photographs, a comprehensive archive of crimes that would eventually send shockwaves through the highest levels of American government, and she needed to make sure it was safe before she ran. She needed a few more hours. Those hours cost her everything. And yet, consider what her sacrifice ultimately produced. the fall of a criminal conspiracy that had shaped American industrial development for 3 decades, federal reforms that protected the lives of hundreds of thousands of workers, the exposure of corruption that extended into the halls of federal government, the survival of evidence that brought, even imperfectly and far too late, some measure of justice to 93 victims and their families. All of it rested on a woman who sat in a small hidden room in the winter of 1887, in the dark, with everything closing in around her, and chose to document rather than run. The 4 words she left on that torn journal page in the foyer that December morning, "The truth must survive," were not just a message, they were a decision, a commitment made in full knowledge of the cost. She kept that commitment in the darkness of that sealed room, scratching her brother's name into the floor with a piece of jewelry, writing herself into history with the last tools available to her. The powerful men who sealed her inside that room believed they were ending her story. They had no idea they were preserving it. What do you think? Could organized conspiracies like the Pittsburgh Circle exist in the modern era, using corporate structures, digital surveillance, and global financial networks to achieve the same ends through different means? Leave your thoughts below. If this story moved you, if Evangelene's courage and the darkness of what was done to her stayed with you, share this video with someone who needs to hear her name. Subscribe to Hollow Century for more stories from the forgotten darkness of history. The truth must survive.